Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. No. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Today on CityCast Madison. Election day is next Tuesday, and one of the top ticket items on the ballot for Madisonians is the city's budget referendum, a $22 million ask to Madison residents to help close our city's budget gap. If it doesn't pass, jobs and services are at stake. But opponents to the measure say the city could be doing more to find money either from the state or by tightening its belt. So what's really at stake, and what exactly will this money be used for? To help you better understand this referendum ahead of the polls, we sat down with Isthmus reporter Liam Barron, who's been covering this issue for the latest. It's Wednesday, October 30th. I'm Bianca Martin, and here's what Madison's talking about. Liam, hello.
Hi, Bianca. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here. So, the referendum for the city, it's huge. It's a big moment. Here in Madison, we've got this $22 million referendum on our upcoming ballot. That was voted in mid-August by our city council overwhelmingly to be placed on our ballot. So before we get too deep, what is this referendum? What form is it taking?
So a budget referendum like this is a property tax increase. So this one will be, as you mentioned, for $22 million, and that's going towards the city's operating costs. So a little bit of city budgeting basics. The city has both a capital budget, that's what's used for longer-term infrastructure investments, say like a building, and an operating budget. That's what's used for day-to-day costs, typically what we see as staffing, benefits, that sort of thing. So this operating referendum will be used to cover those costs. The city currently has a $22 million budget deficit, and so if voters choose to pass the referendum in November, that property tax increase will be passed on. So it'll look like about a $20 per month increase to property taxes on an average value Madison home, which is around $457,000. So if your home has a lower property value than that, then the cost monthly will go down.
Mm-hmm. Does it impact renters at all, or just mostly the people who own homes?
So it will impact renters, but in more of a case-by-case basis. It's ultimately up to your landlord in terms of how much of those costs are passed down. The city has tried to run estimates in terms of what the impact on renters will look like, but it is sort of complicated because it's not something that's mandated.
Mm-hmm. So, when you're explaining this city ask to people, what are some of the key aspects Madison voters should really understand before they get to this November vote?
Yeah, so I think there are quite a few things. One, and this has certainly been a focus of the city's messaging, is that if the referendum doesn't pass, there will be budget cuts. Mayor Sacha Rhodes Conway has released 2 executive budget proposals. One operates as if the referendum passes in November, and another operates as if it doesn't. And so the most recent news that we got, the city would be looking at about a $5.6 million budget cut in 2025 if the referendum were not to pass, which means that around 18 positions would be cut. And it's still sort of up in the air what exactly those would be, and ultimately would have to go for the Common Council. But those would be city services. One of the more headlining ones has been potential cuts to library hours. So what Mayor Rhodes Conway put forth in their most recent proposal was that only Central Library would have Sunday hours at this point. Other things voters should note, and again, this is something that the city has continually put forward as well, is that ultimately, and this goes for every Wisconsin municipality, it's not just Madison, but revenue-raising methods for municipalities in Wisconsin are pretty limited. Other revenue-raising methods, such as, say, a local sales tax, fully paid municipal service funding, these sorts of methods are not available because of restrictions at the state level. And there's not much that the city can do to get around that, meaning that, the property tax really has become a pretty ubiquitous revenue-raising method. And you're seeing this around municipalities in Dane County, not just Madison, that are looking to go to property tax referendums. So while the city can lobby for change at the state level, that's not at all guaranteed. It will also depend on what the legislative composition looks like post-November, which could be, more amenable to the city's desires, especially if Democrats take the assembly. But it's still not guaranteed that the city will make any progress in that regard. And so it does put, the city of Madison in a bind. Obviously, they don't want to have to lay off workers, but they also don't want to raise property taxes. Recently, at a forum that the Wisconsin Policy Forum hosted alongside MMSD Superintendent Joe Gothard, Madison Mayor Sacha Rhodes Conway outright said, ideally this referendum would not have to be passed, but this is a situation that the city doesn't entirely have control over. At the same time, and I know you had mentioned Paul Soglin earlier, there is a counter argument that the city, has known about this situation for a while, that there has been this ongoing fear that the city would run into a budget sort of crisis like it's facing now. And so opponents of the referendum point to the fact that, they say the city hasn't lobbied hard enough, that it hasn't taken proactive measures to reduce spending or ultimately prepare for the situation that it faces. And the city has its counter arguments to that. But there is I guess what I mean to say is that there is an opposing argument to this, that the city hasn't been proactive enough.
And maybe we start there with the opposition, because one thing that's on my mind, of course, I'm sure is on many, is just like, what are people thinking? What do Madisonians, are they leaning one way or the other? And I was going to ask you who's come out to support, but as we're talking about, there is opposition. I saw a recent article that you and Judy Davidoff put out about Paul Soglin and the opposition movement. Can you just talk a little bit more about that in terms of basically our former mayor is, making some noise and asking people to vote against this referendum? Like, what's that about?
Mm-hmm. Recently, former Madison Mayor Paul Soglin held a press conference urging a no vote on the referendum. And his argument is sort of the one that I had outlined just now, that the city hasn't done enough to lobby the state legislature. He's particularly drawn a contrast with what Milwaukee did to get a 2023 shared revenue deal passed, which ultimately didn't just increase shared revenue payouts for Milwaukee. It increased shared revenue payouts for municipalities across the state. And the city argues that Milwaukee was facing a much different situation. And to be fair, Milwaukee was at a much worse point where it was near financial insolvency.
Right. That was my recollection when we talked to the city budget director on CityCast. He said, yes, and Milwaukee was in such a different situation when they were able to broker that deal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there were much more intense worries about what a bad financial state for Milwaukee would look like at that point. Not that Madison doesn't have worries, but it wasn't as severe as what's going on in Milwaukee. Another thing that Soglin sort of proposes is that the city fills some of its current budget deficit with its rainy day fund. There are some concerns from the city's end on that. Most notably is that if that rainy day fund drops below 15% of the city's general fund balance, the city's AAA bond rating is put at risk, which puts it in peril in terms of financing projects, which is a big concern.
Do we have any sense, so obviously we're hearing opposition from the former mayor of how Madisonians are feeling about the referendum? I know that organizations have also come out in support.
I think among the city's more progressive citizens, there is broad support for the referendum, mostly owing to the fact that if it doesn't pass, there will have to be layoffs. That's something that in a city council meeting that folks continually mentioned. The threat of layoffs is sort of the uniting factor among many of the referendum supporters. I do think there is a pretty widespread concern both among alders and among the mayor's office in terms of voters getting information about the referendum.
Yeah.
It's a pretty complicated topic. Budget discussions in general are complicated. And so if voters don't know what the referendum is exactly asking or why the city needs it, that is something that the city is concerned about. And yeah, the way ballot language on referendums is constructed is also governed by state statute. So it's tough for the city to explain exactly what's going on.
Yes. And I want to get into that. I wanted to highlight, just to your point you made a moment ago about the folks sort of on the progressive wing wanting to avoid layoffs. I saw like kind of the labor union representing much of the city. It was supporting the referendum. American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFSCME Local 6000, has been like distributing yard signs emblazoned with "Vote Yes." I saw that from WKOW. I've seen some of those signs. So those are some of the people like exactly like there's going to be layoffs, and I'm pretty sure it's it's like it's across the board, right? Is it targeting certain departments more than others?
So it is across the board. And to my knowledge, there's not like a specific departmental targeting. The city is ultimately going to try and target services that are deemed less crucial, and particularly like service-facing, i.e. the ones that people directly interact with. There is sort of an interesting dynamic in terms of how cuts to police and fire departments work, because under the shared revenue deal that Milwaukee got passed, you cannot cut police and fire departments, also EMS, to a certain extent without dinging 15% of your shared revenue payouts. So in that way, the police and fire departments are a little bit more insulated from cuts than other departments might be.
This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. I want to take a moment to thank a few people. Thank you to Jordan, to Nawal, and to Scott for being excellent therapists along my mental health journey. They've helped me better understand myself, given me compassion as I process my past experiences, offered deep insights around complicated social and family dynamics, and when appropriate, laughed with me at the ridiculous lemons thrown my way. It's always a great time to focus on gratitude, and along with whom I just shouted out, there's another person that we don't think enough, ourselves. It's sometimes hard to remind ourselves that we are doing our best. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. You just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists anytime free of charge. So let the gratitude flow with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/citycast today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/citycast.
¿Hablas español?
Sprichst du Deutsch?
Kan du norsk?
If you've heard that sound from Babbel before, I bet you do. Babbel is the science-backed language learning app that actually works. With quick 10-minute lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts, Babbel gets you on your way to speaking a new language in just a few weeks. With over 16 million subscriptions sold and a 20-day money-back guarantee, just start speaking another language with Babbel. Right now, up to 55% off your Babbel subscription at babbel.com/Spotify podcast. Spelled BABBEL.com/Spotify podcast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
So we were talking about just how complicated we've been trying to do our effort here on CityCast. And, we had the president of the Common Council on and the budget city director. We're talking with you to try and help get clear information on this referendum because it really has been a challenge. And we've seen that from some of the council members when communicating just around the misinformation when it comes to referendum's purpose and combating misinformation and having challenges there. Can you talk about that and like what has the city been doing, if anything, to help address that?
So I think, first of all, there is definitely this concern that voters don't exactly know what's going on with the referendum. To address that, one thing that the city has been doing is almost, I guess, what you could describe as office hours, both with, say, City Finance Director Dave Schmidtke, but also alders in their districts, taking time to chat with voters about, what is this referendum covering? What sort of cuts might we be facing? I had seen they essentially didn't ask me anything with Dave Schmidtke to try and get voters some information on what all is at stake in terms of passing the referendum. The city's comms office has also been pretty proactive in trying to send out messaging about the referendum.
Is this vote historic in a sense in terms of a property tax increase? I understand, is this the first time that this has happened? And how does that fit into the broader kind of historical context of city funding and fiscal strategy?
Yes, this is the first time that the city of Madison has gone to a property tax referendum. So, it's interesting. When you think of property tax referendums, you really mostly think of school districts. MMSD has been very successful in getting its property tax referendums passed. The city has never before done this. So I think city officials would certainly argue, yes, this is historic in the sense of being a result of diminished local control over municipal finance.
Right, and that's sort of the argument that we're hearing from Mayor Satya Rhodes Conway and the city is we are in a tough position with the state, and my understanding is that they have made efforts to lobby or try and get this to change that haven't been successful. That is one of the core arguments, as you mentioned, former Mayor Paul Soglin is making. I couldn't help but think, reading that story, that is this person running for office again in terms of this complaint? I don't know if it holds water. I feel, if you have a pretty locked legislature, how much can you ask when the answer is no? I don't know if you have any more context on that, but that was something that struck me. It's like, is this person running again?
Yeah, and to his credit, he'll say, no, I'm not running again.
And one of the big issues that has been called for from residents is not only information, but transparency. Can you talk about how the city has taken actions to be transparent on this process, even if it is complicated in its nature?
Yeah, I think the biggest one that city officials point to is the city's budget page, which has both per agency cut requests and also copies of the budget requests, both in terms of the situation in which the referendum passes and the situation in which the referendum doesn't pass. So through those resources, you can gain a sense of which exact positions would be cut, how much of a financial impact to the dollar does that have. And so that's sort of the city's big effort in terms of providing transparency to voters on what exactly all this means.
Based on your reporting, what do you think are the most misunderstood aspects of the referendum?
Oh gosh, this is a good question. One, in terms of what it covers, I think there has sometimes been an argument that, the city is going to use this to construct new projects, and that's just not how city budgeting works. This isn't a capital budget referendum, and therefore it's not going to be used for that purpose. I think I don't know if I would necessarily call this misinformation, but just a differing sort of perception on how city budgeting has worked, is the idea that the city has overspent on staffing compared to what the per capita spending on staffing was. The city actually spends less per capita on staff now than it did 10 years ago, which is a pretty constant refrain in the mayor's comments on this referendum. And so that's been back and forth argument in terms of this idea of Madison's fiscal responsibility in all of this. And on the city's end, they'll argue, well, we're spending less per capita on staff than we had previously, despite the fact that the city is growing. And that is something that I do think is notable about the referendum and its place in the city's finances, is that Madison is an incredibly rapidly growing city. And that does put a strain on city services in a way that, increases demand. So to some degree, this referendum seeks to accommodate that growth.
In the case that it fails, which is a possibility. There will be not only cuts to the city, but fees added for residents to help make up for this budget shortfall, correct?
That's correct, yeah. So what the city would do is look at new special charge language. So Madison currently has two predominant special charges. These are charges that are added to what's colloquially known as a water bill, but is technically known as municipal service bill, that are monthly charges based on parcel type. Currently, the city has an urban forestry charge and a recycling charge. So yeah, those are charges that are directly tied to services provided, and they can't exceed the services price, which is important to note in terms of like they aren't really a revenue raising method as much as they are a budget balancing method. So you can't exceed the price of a service with that. But yes, the city would look to institute new special charge language if the referendum fails. That would most likely be, according to City Finance Director Dave Schmidtke, a road infrastructure charge, which would just seek to repair aging Madison roads.
We'll definitely also link in our show notes so folks, if they want to go back and listen to our conversation with Dave Schmidtke, when they're making the pitch for this, as well as the president for the Common Council in our conversation with them, which is also making a pitch for the referendum. This sort of impacts, if the referendum passes, which is what the city hopes for, what long-term changes might the city make to try and avoid similar budget issues in the future? Is that under discussion?
That certainly is, yeah. I think there's already a sense from the mayor that the current situation is not tenable. And so on the one hand, there will certainly be a more proactive lobbying effort from the city in terms of lobbying the state legislature for municipal finance change. That was a big focus of some of the Common Council meetings over the summer in terms of how the city might change how it lobbies. And certainly with the expected political dynamic changes in the legislature, the city feels like it has a more realistic chance at getting some progress in that regard.
Well, that's some positive news. I like to try and get some in conversation.
Yeah. And on the city budget end, I think there is, going to be this continual concern over these next 2 years, whether a referendum passes or doesn't, in terms of downsizing and making sure that the city can stay within the financial state that it has, because ultimately what Rhodes Conway has argued is that without change at the legislative level, the city will have to go back to referendum or find other ways of raising revenue if it wants to keep accommodating growth at the level that it has.
Well, Liam, thank you so much for coming on today. This has been so insightful and helpful, and we really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Bianca.
That's Liam Barron, reporter and staff writer at the Isthmus. We'll link to his recent stories on the budget deficit and this referendum ask in our show notes. That's all for today, here on CityCast Madison. I'm Bianca Martin. If you enjoyed the show, why not share this episode with someone who relies on Madison's city services? We'll be back tomorrow morning with more stories from around the city. Until then, take very good care.